"Let me out of here," he shouted. "Let me out. Let me out." Kept in a small room with no windows, he started banging on the wall to get the attention of the others. "You have no right to hold me here," he screamed. The man enlisted to help that day sat at the control console. He started to get nervous. He could hear the muffled pleas from the other room. He looked up at the man in charge, and, as if stating something not already terribly obvious, said, "He's in pain." But the man in charge showed no emotion. Nothing. He said only one thing: "The experiment requires that you continue." And so the man enlisted to help that day turned back to the control panel, muttering to himself, "It's got to go on. It's got to go on." He flipped the switch and administered another electric shock to the stranger in the other room. "You have no right to hold me here," shouted the man in the other room again. But no one answered him and the experiment continued. "Let me out," he continued to scream hysterically. "My heart's bothering me. Let me out." Then suddenly, the screaming stopped and the experiment was over. As World War II was moving toward its conclusion, the main architects of the Nazi movement Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels managed to escape capture by committing suicide. Others were not able to avoid justice. They were rounded up and put on trial for their roles in the systematic genocide committed during the war. Crimes against humanity was one of the charges levied against the 24 most senior Nazis captured, most of whom were found guilty for their respective roles. But there was one man who was conspicuously absent during the Nuremberg trials. Nazi SS Obersturmbannführer, or Lieutenant Colonel, Adolf Eichmann played a significant role in the organizing of the Holocaust. He was responsible for managing the logistics of rounding up and deporting mass numbers of Jews and other unwanted groups to the ghettos and concentration camps across Eastern Europe. He was the one who oversaw the process that sent innocent men, women, and children, young and old, to the death camps. But after the war, using falsified papers, he was able to escape Germany and make his way to Argentina. For 15 years Eichmann lived a relatively normal, suburban life under the name Ricardo Clement until he was captured by Israeli agents in 1960 and brought back to face trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann's capture reignited debate over how the Holocaust could have happened in the first place. It wasn't possible for just a few warped minds to have effectively committed genocide on such a remarkable scale. That amount of planning and organization and logistics required the help of thousands if not millions of people. It required the involvement of all levels of soldiers perpetrating the actual crimes and millions of ordinary Germans willfully turning a blind eye. Some believed that there was a collective intent, that an entire population had abandoned all humanity and morality. Others saw it differently. The common defense that many Nazis and Germans offered after the war was less dramatic. "We had no choice," they said, "we were just following orders." That was the mantra. Whether they were senior officials held accountable for their roles, or ordinary soldiers and civilians who tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy after the upheaval of the war, they were able to rationalize their actions, avoiding personal responsibility by holding their superiors accountable. This is what they would tell their grandchildren. "We were just following orders." Stanley Milgram, a Yale psychologist, wanted to understand more. Were we humans such lemmings that if someone who outranked us, someone in a position of authority, ordered us to do something entirely counter to our moral code, our sense of right and wrong, we would simply obey? Sure, it's possible on a small scale, but on such a mass scale. So in 1961, just a few months after Adolf Eichmann's trial began in Israel, Milgram designed an experiment to understand our obedience to authority. The experiment was relatively simple. In each enactment, there were two volunteers. One would play the role of the teacher and the other would play the role of the student. The person who played the student was actually another scientist involved in the experiment. To assign the roles, the real volunteer was asked to pick a piece of paper out of a hat that indicated if they would be the teacher or the student. In fact, both folded pieces of paper said teacher on them, giving the illusion to the volunteer that their role was picked by chance. The volunteers who played the role of the teachers, recruited from a newspaper ad and told they were taking part in an investigation into memory and learning, sat at a console with a series of switches. Each one was told that a series of questions would be asked of the student. If the student got the wrong answer or refused to answer the question, the teacher was to flip a switch on the console to administer an electric shock to the student. In fact, the only electric shocks administered during the entire experiment were mild, 15-volt shocks given to the teachers just so they could have a sense of what it felt like. There were 30 switches on the console, labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts. With each switch labeled in 15-volt increments, it was made very clear to the teacher that with each switch the shocks would get increasingly more severe. To make sure that the teacher understood the implications of the increasing severity of the shocks, there were also labels placed above certain ranges. The voltage range of 15 to 75, for example, was labeled slight shock. Written above the 75 to 120 volt range of switches was moderate shock. The 135 to 180 volt range was labeled strong shock. Very strong shock, intense shock and extreme intensity shock covered the next few ranges until the voltages reached danger, severe shock above the 375 to 420 volt switches. The final range, 435 to 450 volts, was painted red and marked simply XXX. There was no confusion as to what the switches meant. The 160 volunteers were put through the experiment with 4 variations, 40 volunteers for each setup. In one variation, the scientist playing the student sat right next to the teacher and the teacher had to physically place the student's hand onto a shock plate. In another variation, the student was in the room with the teacher. The teacher could see and hear the student's reactions after each shock was administered. There was no uncertainty about the impact of each successive decision to flip a switch. In another variation, the student was kept in a separate room. Though the teacher was unable to see the effects of the shocks, they could clearly hear the student's protests and screams through the walls. In all of these variations, the teacher could hear the scientist playing the role of the student pretending to express discomfort at first and then shouting and pleading for the experiment to end as it progressed. "Stop," they would scream. "This hurts." In yet one more variation, however, the student was kept in another room, and but for thumping on the walls, the teacher could neither see nor hear the student's reactions to the shocks. As expected, all the volunteers expressed concern. As they realized or believed they were causing pain to the student, they would look up to the scientist, standing next to them in a white lab coat with clipboard in hand, and ask if they should continue despite the pain they were knowingly inflicting. The first time the volunteer expressed a desire to stop the experiment or no longer be a part of it, the scientist would say, "Please continue." If the volunteer expressed a desire to stop a second time, the scientist would always say, "The experiment requires that you continue." As they went further and further down the line of switches, some of the volunteers started to get nervous. Very nervous. They started sweating and shaking. Although extremely uncomfortable, most went on with the experiment. Upon the third request to halt the experiment, the scientist replied coldly, "It is absolutely essential that you continue." After a fourth protest, the scientist responded simply, "You have no other choice, you must go on." If any other protests were expressed, the experiment would immediately end. How far do you think you would go? How much pain could you cause someone before you would stop? Most of us would say we would not go very far and that we would have quit long before we believed we had caused any serious harm to someone. And the scientists expected the same thing. Before the experiment, they predicted that 2% to 3% would go all the way, and those people would exhibit psychopathic tendencies. But the actual results were horrifying. When the volunteers had to physically place the student's hand on the shock plate, 70% quit the experiment without going very far. When the volunteers were in the same room but didn't have to physically touch the student, the number went down slightly, with 60% refusing to continue. but when they could neither see the students in pain nor hear their cries, only 35% refused to continue. That means 65% of the volunteers were able to go through the entire experiment, reach the final switch and, for all intents and purposes, kill someone. The experiment has been criticized for being unethical, and for good reason. Nearly 80 people who woke up that morning with the belief they were good people went home that day with the knowledge they could kill someone. Though they expressed concern, though they were nervous, though they had a sense that what they were doing could have a negative impact, even a seriously negative impact, the majority still went all the way. Upon the conclusion of the experiment, despite believing that the student may be hurt or worse, the volunteers expressed concern for their own culpability, insisting that they should not be held responsible. Not a single volunteer showed any concern for the student's well-being. None asked to look in the other room. They were more concerned with their own skins. Eventually, the volunteers were debriefed and shown that the student, who was played by a scientist, was fine and unhurt. They were assured that no shocks were given and that no pain was caused at any time. Some of those who obeyed, who went all the way, now felt remorse for what they had done. They had a sense of personal responsibility. Others who went all the way, in contrast, justified their actions by blaming the scientists. If there were any repercussions, they reasoned, it would be the guys in charge, not them, who would be held responsible. After all, they were just doing as they were told. Some even went so far as to transfer blame to the student. He was so stupid and stubborn, said one volunteer trying to come to terms with his actions, he deserved to be shocked. Interestingly, nearly all those volunteers who refused to continue to take part in the experiment once they realized they were causing pain to someone else felt accountable to a greater moral imperative. Some were religious, but all of them felt they were accountable to a higher authority than the scientists in the room. The reality is, Milgram's experiment is being carried out every single day in offices across the country and around the world. The cycle of abstraction endemic to our brand of capitalism is easily seen when we take a broader view of Milgram's conclusions. Abstraction is no longer restricted to physical space, it also includes the abstracting nature of numbers. The bigger our companies get, the more physical distance is created between us and the people who work for us or buy our products. At such scale, we can no longer just walk into the aisles and count the cans of soup on the shelf either. Now we rely on documents that report the numbers of what we've sold and how much we've made. When we divorce ourselves from humanity through numerical abstraction, we are, like Milgram's volunteers, capable of inhuman behavior. Just like the conditions Milgram set in his experiment, the physical separation between us and those on the receiving end of our decisions can have a dramatic impact on lives, the lives of people who cannot be seen or heard. The more abstract people become, the more capable we are of doing them harm.